and welcome back to video number 15 in this series looking at editing images with the levels command right here at freephotoshop.com. In this tutorial I'm going to give you our first real look at the eyedropper tools that are available inside the levels dialog box, and I've got 4 images open here inside Photoshop to give you a few quick demonstrations with, and we're going to brush through 3 of these images pretty fast and then spend a little more time on one of them and get things looking good using not only the eyedroppers but a few techniques we've looked at in previous videos in this series. Okay, so the first image we have on screen here is a photograph I took about last year, I think it was, called Water Road Panorama, and we're not going to spend too much time on this image. I'm going to use it in a way of an introduction to the eyedroppers. Before I do that, however, we need to open up levels. Now, since we started looking at non-destructive editing way back in video number 10, we haven't really used the static version from up here in the Adjustments submenu, found as always under the Image menu, all that much. In fact, apart from a couple of occasions where we applied it to a mask, we've been using an adjustment layer instead. Now, the only annoying thing about that is the static version of levels that we can apply from the Adjustments submenu has its own keyboard shortcut, which is Control-L here on the PC, and that's Command-L on the Mac. And as a default, we can't apply a levels adjustment layer using a keyboard shortcut, but I'm going to show you how to change that. I'm going to come up here to the Edit menu and then select Keyboard Shortcuts. Now at the moment my keyboard shortcuts are working from a file called Matt's Keyboard Shortcuts. You'll also be working from the Photoshop defaults unless you've added some of your own custom shortcuts and then saved them, as I have. But what we're going to do here is choose to set shortcuts for application menus, then select the layer drop down menu, then we'll come down until we see adjustment layers, which is a little way down here, and there it is. Now I'll click on the levels option and enter the keyboard shortcut I want to use to apply a levels adjustment layer. And I think what's best here, certainly for this series, is to use the shortcut we already know, and that's Control-L here on the PC, Command-L over on the Mac. Now when I enter that, as I've done here, Photoshop's going to warn me that the shortcut is already in use by the levels command from the Adjustment submenu. But that's okay, we already know that, so I'm going to click this button down here to accept the change and the conflict. Now I'm being told I've modified my settings up here, so I'll click the little save icon to save over my original settings and add this new shortcut into the Matt's Keyboard Shortcuts file. Now I'll hit OK to exit the dialog box, and from here I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer. So I'll do that by hitting our brand new keyboard shortcut, Control-L or Command-L on the Mac, and it works. Wow, what a relief. Now I'm going to hit the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac to accept that default name and open up the dialog box. Now let's have a look at those eyedroppers finally here and see how they're going to help us out. In the last video we looked at neutral colours, and that's a good start to work out what they actually attempt to do to an image. So let's check them out, and once we've seen the results we'll look at some do's and don'ts. In fact, just before we do that, I'm going to quit out of levels here and then just click on the wing menu of the histogram and select expanded view. So we now have a 256 pixel wide histogram, so it can accommodate a line or a bar in the graph for every brightness value that's inside our photograph. And if you're following along with me here, then you'll get a load of stats beneath the histogram, and you can turn that section off from the wing menu. The next step here is to drag the info palette until I see a blue line between the 2 clusters, and then drop it here so we get a view of both the histogram from out here and the info palette. Now I'll hit Control or Command-L once again to open up levels, and I'll just go ahead and accept that default name. Now, as I was saying, we can set our shadows to black with the black eyedropper, our highlights to white with the white eyedropper, and also neutralize our midtones with the grey eyedropper. So I'll go ahead and start by selecting the black eyedropper tool. Now the idea here is that we click on the darkest area of the image to turn the pixel to black. Now before we click, we can specify how many pixels we want to sample by right-clicking the image. And I'd say the best option to choose is the point sample to keep things as accurate as we can. In earlier versions of Photoshop, by the way, and if my memory serves me correctly, of course, which it may not, but if it does, to access the sampling options for the eyedropper, you need to do it before you open up levels by selecting the eyedropper tool and then changing the sample options from the options bar in this area up here. You'll find all the options for the eyedropper once you've selected it up here. As I say though, the point sample is the most accurate. All the other options work on an average of pixels. Now here's where the info palette comes in handy. If I hover the eyedropper above this area of shadows inside the trees, you can see that we're getting some pretty dark values. And you can see that I've got things set up to read over here in the info palette, not only the RGB values, but the Cmyk values too. You can change the units of measurement, by the way, via the wing menu inside the info palette itself, if you need to, that is. We're going to forget about the Cmyk values for the moment though, because that's just going to start confusing things if we start looking at those as well. Cmyk, if you wanted to know, is the colour space of ink. So it's measuring the percentage of ink needed in the 4 channels employed by the Cmyk colour space. For the moment we'll concentrate on the RGB values though, because that's the colour mode of light, and we're working on a light emitting computer monitor at the moment, so that's all good. Now I'm going to stop telling you about things that you probably don't want to know right now, and just click here in the shadows of the trees to set the shadows to black. Now the great thing about the eyedroppers is that if you don't get things quite right the first time you click, you can just click again, and your previous click point and the resulting changes it makes to the image will be forgotten. So every time you click, you set a brand new black point in relation to the original image. So for example, if I click over here in the sky to set that pixel and everything darker than that pixel to black, then I realise, for example, that it was actually a mistake to click that pixel, which it actually turns out to be. I can either use my one level of undo here inside the levels dialog box by hitting Ctrl-Z, or I can just click somewhere else more sensible to select a new black point. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and click a few more times in these trees, and I think that's about as good as I'm going to get. Now, we're not seeing a huge amount of change, and that's because if you look at the RGB values in the info palette, the numbers on the left of the slash are the original values, and the numbers on the right are the new values, subject to me hitting the OK button. So we've not made too much of a change there, and that's generally the way to work when using the black and white eyedroppers. So next I'll select the white eyedropper, and this is going to be pretty tough, and I'll try clicking things in the sky up here, and actually that's not too much of a bad result. And I say that because a lot of times the black and white eyedroppers aren't that good for photographic images. If I click in the tree trunk over here, for example, you'll see that we really start to blow up a load of highlights inside the image, and we start to see posterization and colour banding. So I'd say if you're going to use these two eyedroppers, then take real care, and I'll show you some handy ways of using them when we work on the next image, and then in the next tutorial I'll show you a super accurate way of using the eyedroppers, a technique actually that a lot of pros use, a lot of studios use to perfect images. Okay, so just to keep in mind that the black and white eyedroppers aren't always that useful when working with photographic images, but in contrast to that, this grey eyedropper in the middle here is a fantastic tool to use inside photographs. It's always going to give you different results, but then I'd say that's a good thing. So what I'm going to do here is make sure I've got it selected, and then all we need to do is click on a colour inside the image that we believe should be neutral grey. And if I click on this lay-by area of the road here, you'll see that the image changes quite drastically. It changes quite a lot, and as I'd say, if you don't quite get the result you're looking for, then just click again. Click somewhere else inside the image and just use the trial and error technique, I'd say, as much as anything. And you can see in this image we're getting some pretty good results by doing that. Okay, I'm going to hit the OK button to accept these changes, and then I'll turn the adjustment layer off for a second so we can see the original image, and then I'm going to turn it back on again to see it with our levels adjustments applied. And all this has been done with a couple of quick clicks from the free Eyedropper tools available to us inside the Levels dialog box. Okay, so that's a great start. Now I'm going to switch to my next open image called the Blue Roads of Boston. And here in this image we have a little bit of colour adjustments to do because this image has, I'd say, a blue tainted road surface. And we don't want that. We want to neutralise the colours of the road. So we'll hit that new keyboard shortcut that we created earlier on in this tutorial to bring up the levels adjustment layer. And once again, we're not building up a project here, so I'll accept the default name for the layer. Now I'm going to take that black eyedropper and I'm going to find myself a really dark area of the image to click on. Say the base of this lamppost looks quite dark, and indeed the info palette is confirming brightness levels for me, so if I think I've got a dark area I can double check the facts by looking over at the info palette. And as you can see here, this bottom lower area of the lamppost is in fact a very dark area of the image. I could of course look for somewhere over here under the shop, but I'd say that that's already too dark for this particular image. So I'll click the lamppost, and this time we don't get such a good result. Nonetheless, we carry on. I'm going to select the white eyedropper this time, and now I'll look for somewhere to set our white point, and I'm going to click, say, these white road markings, because after all, white road markings should indeed be white. And oh dear, that's done a very, very bad job. Good job of the markings, mind you, but if you look up here at the sky and this building up here, it's just blown out the sky completely, and this building is also suffering from some form of posterization now. And that's just an important subject to cover actually that we'll do now whilst we're talking about it. With any command inside Photoshop that spreads and shifts brightness levels inside an image, you always run the risk of producing small banding effects and the posterization of details ultimately. And to see what I actually mean by posterization or banding, whichever you prefer, I'm going to cancel out of here, and then I'll switch to this image here that displays two gradients of red to black across the screen. The top one here is a smooth gradient, and that's exactly the kind of continuous tones you want to employ in your photographs. You can't actually see any sharp changes in colour, it's just one smooth transition from red to black, and as far as your eyes can tell anyway. The gradient underneath it, unfortunately, has the dreaded banding or posterization effect applied to it. Instead of seeing a nice smooth transition of colour, we can actually see the shifts in colour as it changes from red to black. Now commands like levels and curves, commands that amend brightness values inside an image, can sometimes start to produce this kind of unwanted effect, especially as your modifications become more extreme and more intense. So it's always worth keeping an eye on your images to make sure you're avoiding this at all costs. And by the way, whilst the whole point of posterization is if it looks bad to the eye, if you're looking at a photograph and you can visibly tell the posterization and banding from within it, that's when you know you've got problems. But you can also see the start of problems inside the histogram when you develop large areas of spikes, a little like a comb or something like that. Now if I switch back to the Blue Roads of Boston image, just to further demonstrate the effects you want to avoid, I'm going to come down here to the adjustments layer icon and select the Posterize adjustment layer, and I'll change the levels to 10 and then hit OK. And although this is a really extreme example, what we've done is allowed each channel inside the image to retain 10 brightness levels. So that gives the image a total of, if you do the maths, it gives the image a total of 1000 colours to work with, a lot less than the usual 16.7 million inside an 8-bit per channel RGB image. Now if we look at the road, you'll notice that instead of our continuous tone photograph, we have some really harsh transitions going on, something we call colour banding or posterization. And that's generally the effect that we'll be wanting to avoid. I mean, the whole image is now suffering from that because we've been so extreme with the posterize adjustment layer. But just in a way of showing you exactly what we want to avoid by heavily editing the levels adjustment layer, or levels in any way, in fact. Now the reason we're talking about posterization is because if we're taking a histogram, which we're always doing when we use the levels commands, and then start stretching out the values, which again we're ultimately going to do when we use levels or curves or any other command like that. When we do that, when we use those commands, we stretch out the brightness values and we're going to leave gaps. That's what we're ultimately going to do. And those gaps can in some cases lead us to a posterization effect we see on screen. And that's pretty much what happened when we started using that white eyedropper tool when we really didn't need to. In fact, what we ended up doing was taking the highlights and stretching them out to the degree of making some of the highlights completely banned, completely posterized. And we definitely don't want to do that inside any of our images. That's ultimately what we're trying to avoid doing. We're trying to use levels to correct an image or to adjust an image, but when we go to the point of destroying it, and destroying the brightness values, then we have to think twice about what we're actually doing and the edits that we're actually making. So I'm going to go ahead and chuck away this posterize adjustment layer. And now what I'm going to do is re-enter levels, and this time, instead of messing around with the black and white eyedroppers, I'm going to come straight to the grey one. And then I'll try clicking here in the road. And wow, see the difference we've made with just one click of the eyedropper tool to set that point to neutral grey. It really is amazing that we can make such a great modification in such an easy fashion. Okay, we're done with this image. I'm going to come out of here and then switch to the next image I want to use, and this time we're going to spend a little bit of time getting this one the way we want it. Now before we do anything, I'm going to come up here to the image menu, select mode, and then switch the image to the 16 bits per channel mode. And we've already discussed 16 bits per channel mode in a previous tutorial, so if you want more information you can go ahead and check out that tutorial. I think it's the 12th video in this series, all about the levels command. Anyway, what we're going to do now is give ourselves more room to work effectively. In 16-bit mode we're going to suffer a lot less from posterization amongst other things. In fact, we can make some really dramatic edits now and not suffer from posterization in the way that we did with the 8 bits per channel mode, because as we discussed back in that tutorial, we've got so many more brightness levels now to work with. By switching to this 16-bit per channel mode, we're just going to give ourselves more editing flexibility, which is always good news. Now I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer, and I'm going to call this one grey point. Because I'm going to use this layer to set the grey point, of course, that's why I'm calling it that. So I'll select the grey eyedropper tool and then start experimenting. And I really do mean start experimenting. Anywhere you click is going to give you a different result, so it's best to just keep clicking until you see something you like. But when I was practicing, as I said before, what I was doing primarily before I found this point to click, I was just clicking everywhere. I was just clicking the sand and seeing what that did. I was clicking around about here to see what that did, and ultimately I came to the mountain range and that gave me the best result. Anyway, clicking here really starts to bring out those mountains, and we start to get our sand back to yellow, which is good. I mean, look at the difference we have already. I'm going to switch the preview off to see the original image, and then turn it back on again to see our changes. And I hope you'll agree we've already made a big difference to the image. The only slight problem that we have, just looking at those before and after shots, is that we've taken some of the blueness out of the sky, and we don't really want to do that. So guess what? We're going to go ahead and mask out the sky so that the adjustment layer isn't being so harsh in its adjustments towards the sky. So we're going to mask out the sky, and we've already covered basic masking in video tutorial number 11, I think it was, of this series. So not to send anyone to sleep, I've already created an outline of the sky. This time though, I haven't done it as a conventional mask that's found in the channels palette. And if I switch over here to the paths palette, you can see that I've drawn the outline of the sky as a path. And just for your information, if you want to know how I did it, so you can have a crack at doing it yourself maybe, I used the good old pen tool, perhaps the most awkward tool in the whole of Photoshop. Anyway, I'm going to click on it and that will show me the path on screen. It will effectively select the path. But what I want to do is load the path as a proper selection outline. And I can do that by control clicking on it here on the PC, or command clicking on it over on the Macintosh side of things. and then I'm going to switch back to the layers palette and target the mask by clicking it. Then I'll hit the letter D followed by the letter X to set my swatches to their default colours and then switch them around, which should leave them as black as the foreground colour down here. And now what I'm going to do is use that keyboard shortcut Ctrl-Alt-D here on the PC, that's Command-Option-D on the Mac, to open up the feathering properties for the selection outline. And I'll select, say, a 1.5 pixel feather and click OK. Now to fill the selected area with black, I'm going to hit Alt-Delete here on the PC, that's Option-Delete on the Mac, and whoops, that's not exactly what I wanted to happen. Unfortunately, what I've done wrong here, I should say, is, well, it actually all goes back to that damn path outline. What I must have done was drew a path around everything in the image but the sky. So now what we've done is masked out everything but the sky, which is the opposite to what we wanted to do. Oh well, there's an easy way to fix that. I'm going to make sure the mask is selected and then hit Ctrl-D to deselect the image. That's Command-D on the Mac. Then I'll hit Ctrl-I to invert the mask, so black turns to white and white turns to black, and things are looking much better. They're looking exactly as we wanted now. The only trouble is, what we've actually done is gone a little too far, I'd say. We've gone a little too extreme with our adjustments. So seeing as we've got the mask selected, I'm going to come up here to the Image menu, select Adjustments, and then choose the Levels command, the Static Levels command from up here. Applying levels directly to the mask now isn't going to be a problem because we're effectively dealing with a grayscale image. That's exactly what a mask is. So I'll grab this black point output slider and then move it along to a brightness value of, say, 130 brightness levels. So we're hitting a middle of the road grey, and that's looking pretty good. I'm going to hit OK to leave this dialog box, and things are starting to take shape. Now what I'm going to do here is add another levels adjustment layer, and this time call it white point. Now I'm going to do a couple of things that perhaps you weren't expecting me to do. The first one is to double left click the white eyedropper to bring up the colour options for the eyedropper itself. Now here I can do as we did in the previous few videos where we were setting colours for the auto and option controls, but this time we're just setting the colour solely for use with this particular eyedropper tool. So we're not worrying about any of the auto functions, we're not going to be adjusting those. The controls inside the options section of this dialog box that we looked at in the previous couple of tutorials are completely independent to what you're seeing here. So we're now just affecting the actual eyedropper tools inside the levels dialog box. We're not going into any auto functions or any more additional options. So this time I'm going to work with the Hsl controls, those being the controls for the hue, saturation and brightness of pixels inside the image, and I'll set the hue and saturation values to 0 and then set the brightness to something like 95%. 100% would give us pure white, 0% would represent black, and 95% is a very light grey as it turns out. It'll look just like white though when we start using it. Now I'm going to OK my way out of here, and you could, if you wanted to be extra careful, zoom into the image and use the info palette to assist you in clicking on the brightest cloud. I'm going to use another little technique though, something that we've used quite a few times already, and that's to Alt drag or Option drag on the Mac this white point slider here inside the composite view of the histogram, and now we can see that the hottest clouds, where the image is turning white of course, are up in the top left corner of this document, and those clouds around that area there, so just about here we're hitting the whitest point of the image. So I'll bring the white point slider back to where we picked it up, and then I'm going to go ahead and click on one of these clouds up here, and remember, if you get it wrong first time then just go ahead and click again. Okay, that looks good. We've really brightened up the whole image, so what I'm going to do here is mask out everything but the sky, because I like the sky being that bright. We're in the middle of Death Valley, remember, and this place I think is actually recognised as a desert, so the bright blue sky is exactly how it should be. So I'll click OK to accept these changes, and here we get a little dialog box come up asking us if we want to save the target colours as defaults. and that's only appeared because we've changed one of those target colours. We'll talk a little more about these default target colours in the next tutorial, but for now I'll select no. Okay, now the only job now is to create that second mask for this white point layer, and I'll do that by first of all duplicating this mask down here to the newest layer, and I'll do that by alt dragging it from the grey point layer to the white point layer. That's option dragging it on the Mac. Photoshop's going to ask me if I really want to replace the layer mask, and I do, so I'll hit yes. Now I'll just hit Control or Command I once again to invert the colours inside the mask, so white turns to black, masking the effect out completely, and that value of 130 will turn into a value of around about 124 if you do the maths once again, or something like that. You're not going to see much difference anyway between the original grey and the inverted grey. What I'm going to do, however, and sometimes you think of these things when you're actually working on the image, I guess that's the creative side of the human brain working, but what I'm going to do here is come up to the image menu, select adjustments, and then apply another version of that static levels adjustment. This time though I'll grab the white eyedropper and just click in this grey area representing transparency in the mask to set the area to white, and that will also transform this lower region of the mask that was previously black to a dark grey. So we're now masking out the effect that this adjustment layer has on the lower region of the image and allowing all of the adjustments to shine through the mask by turning this area to white. Finally, I'll raise this black point to the output values to say around about 30 brightness levels, and we're good to go. Or at least we'll hit OK to accept these changes. The only thing I'm tempted to do, seeing as this is such a hot day, I mean the temperature on this particular day was hitting somewhere like 125 degrees here. I mean, I got out the car, took this photograph, and then got back in the car again. It was that hot. Anyway, I'm going to add a little saturation to it, so I'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer from down here, and I'm going for a value here of say 15%, which may be a little too much for what we actually need here, but that's okay. At least you'll still be able to see the effect after I've rendered out the video and compressed it down, so I can place it on the freephotoshop.com website. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that, so I'll click OK. And if you followed along with me, then you may have a different idea of how the image looks and feels, and feel free to adjust the mask and the saturation and also the levels settings in general to come up with something that looks good through your eyes. I mean, this image looks pretty good through my eyes, but you may see it differently. You may want to do something else. Okay, I'm going to come back up here to the image menu, select mode, and now switch the image back to the 8 bits per channel mode so we can save it out as a JPEG or any file format you like. Of course, if you don't want to, if you want to leave this as the 16 bits per channel mode image, then it's perfectly fine to do so, but once you've made your adjustments, I'd recommend coming back to 8 bits per channel mode, especially if it was a JPEG image to begin with, so especially if it was in the 8 bits per channel mode at the beginning. Now let me show you two quick things here. First of all, let's look at the histogram. We now have no gaps between any of the brightness levels. Sure, we have a few spikes going on, but that's not going to be too much of a problem. What I'm trying to say is that we still have a histogram full of information, and that's thanks to editing inside that 16 bits per channel mode. Okay, secondly, take a look at what we've done. I'll use that Alt or Option clicking trick to show a before view of the image, followed by how the image looks with our adjustments applied. Okay, I want to show you one last thing here. I think this is going to be, by the way, the longest tutorial I've ever created, but anyway, we've had loads to talk about, so that's a good thing, I guess. I'm going to switch over to the fifth and final image, and it's actually a rather faded looking black and white drawing of a Ford pickup truck. And this is going to be a real quick one, by the way, but I'm just going to show you how to make this illustration look perfect. Now I'm going to attempt to bring up the levels adjustment layer by pressing Ctrl or Command L on the keyboard, but nothing happens. Also, if we look down here to the adjustments layer icon, it's greyed out. And if I come up here to the image menu, select adjustments, you'll see that the static variations of levels is available, but Loads of the other stuff is greyed out too. So what exactly is going on here? Well, if you look over here to the file extension, you'll notice it's a GIF file or a GIF file, whichever way you want to pronounce it. Either way is acceptable. But what that actually means to us here inside this image and inside Photoshop in general is that we're working inside an indexed color mode. So to get back all of our missing functions here inside Photoshop, we need to come back up here to the image menu, select mode, and then switch the image over to the RGB color mode. Now, even though this seems like a simple solution, it does cause a few folks out there a bit of confusion, so I thought I'd just go ahead and show you what was happening in case you come across this problem yourself. Okay, now I'm going to open up levels, and this is where the black and white eyedroppers excel. Line art. Line art is the reason the black and white eyedroppers are there. This is actually a great thing to do when you're scanning illustrations and drawings into your PC via a scanner. And I'm just going to go ahead and select the black eyedropper tool and click the car, and that will set it to black, a nice rich black. Next I'll use the white eyedropper to set the colour of the paper, and just look at how white that comes up. Look at how great the illustration is looking now. We can also set a different colour for the car using this technique. So I'll go ahead and double click the black eyedropper, and I'll set the hue to 240 and the saturation and brightness to 100%, then click OK to accept those values based on the hue wheel for what it's worth. Now I'll go ahead and make sure I've got the eyedropper selected, and you can press once to select and then press again to deselect. Now I'll click somewhere inside the car to turn it to a nice blue colour, and that looks great. Okay, hopefully we've covered some important ground here. We now know not only how to use the free eyedroppers, but also some really valuable tips and tricks too. In the next video we're going to look at setting the black and white points of an image using pinpoint accuracy here inside Photoshop. Well, I hope you're finding this series on freephotoshop.com to be helpful. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.